Who is Carrie? Who is Carrie? Chapter 1. I got down to the harbor just as the bell in Trinity Church was ringing 2 o'clock. The streets was just as crowded as they could be, and down at the dock it was packed solid. Everybody standing there, looking out into the water, shouting and cheering and all of that. I was late. I wished I had got there sooner, but everybody at Mr. Francis's tavern was all in a sweat about General Washington coming to be inaugurated president, and they made me scrub over the kitchen twice until everything gleamed, even though nobody said nothing about General Washington coming to the tavern, and even if he did come, he wasn't likely to go to the kitchen and fry himself some eggs. Presidents don't fry their own eggs, leastwise, not as I figured. We'd never had a president of the United States before, so I couldn't be sure. Maybe they did fry their own eggs, just to show they was plain folks and all. But the cooks didn't care who was going to fry eggs. Everything in the kitchen had to gleam like the moon, and so I sweat and moaned and told them I'd miss seeing the general land in the harbor, and they said I wasn't to go nowhere. I was to sit right there in the kitchen gleaming things until my arm fell off and go on gleaming with the other arm after that. But of course they skidded off to see Washington themselves, like I knew they would, and as soon as they was out of sight, I skidded off after them, going around by Greenwich Street instead of Broadway so's nobody would spot me. There wasn't nobody in the tavern when I left except the dogs, and they'd have gone too if they had realized what was happening, but nobody told them. Oh, Mr. Francis, if he ever found out we'd all skidded off like that, he'd have a fit. But I couldn't help myself. I just had to see General Washington. There wasn't any reason for seeing him. He was likely to be able to land himself without my help. It was just my dinged curiosity. I couldn't stand for anything to happen without me being in on it. It's why they called me Nosy. It was sunny and beginning to get warm, like it always does in late April in New York. It was a nice day to be out, and every dinged person in the city must have been on the streets. With all that crowd, I couldn't see anything, anyway. I started to wriggle through, going sideways like a fish. They didn't like it none to see a scrawny little black girl wriggling around them like that, pushing and shoving to the front, and they kept giving me looks. But I'd say, "I'm sorry, sir, I've got an important message for Mr. Francis." He kept the most famous tavern in New York, in the whole United States maybe, I reckoned, and people looked up to him. So I pushed on through, asking people if they'd seen Mr. Francis, and praying that they hadn't, because if I ran into him, he'd have a message for me. He'd have a message for me, all right. And by I came out to the waterfront. And there come George Washington. He was in a fancy barge with banners hanging from the side, being rowed by 13 men in white suits. He was dressed in blue and buff, and he was standing in the stern looking around and waving his hat when the people on the dock cheered, which was near constant. Coming beside him was a sloop with a choir of ladies on board it. They was singing something about, "Far be the din of arms, henceforth the olive's charms," which didn't make no sense to me. I couldn't see what olives had to do with it, unless maybe it was true that he cooked for himself and was going to make an olive pie to celebrate being elected president. Other ships was in the harbor too, and the cannons kept going off and the flags whipping around. Oh, there was such a hullabaloo you could hardly hear yourself cheer. It was just about the most exciting thing I ever went to, better than a horse race, and I cheered along with the rest of them, even though I couldn't hear my own voice for the cannonading. Finally the barge pulled up to the dock. They'd got stairs there, and carpet on the stairs, and a whole bunch of colonels and congressmen, and I didn't know what all, shined up like kitchen pots, waiting for him. He climbed up the stairs and shook hands around. I wasn't more than 30 or 40 feet from him. He was very tall, over 6 feet I judged, and getting on for 60 years old, and he had on about the most serious look I'd ever seen on a man. You'd have thought that being elected president, especially the first president of a brand new country that wasn't hardly a week old and hadn't even got hair or teeth yet, he'd be smiling around and congratulating himself on what a great man he was. Most people would have. If you elected an ordinary person president, why, the first thing they do is conclude they deserved it and grin around so's everybody could see how wonderful they was. Horace was sure to do it, sure. He already thought he was wonderful without being elected to anything. If you elected one of the tavern dogs president, he'd think he was wonderful and deserved it and get up on his hind legs and grin so's the people could see how great he was. But General Washington, he just looked solemn and shook everybody's hand. Maybe he was used to being famous and it didn't mean anything to him anymore. Or maybe he was the olive pie, or maybe it was the olive pie that worried him. It would have worried me too. The crowd made way for him and the colonels or whatever they was lined up behind him, and they began to march up the dock. And as the crowd thinned out a little, I saw Mr. Francis. He was looking square at me. I didn't know if he recognized me from the distance, but I turned around quick as lightning and wriggled out of the crowd and shot for home. It was a good thing I'd done it, too, because when I got back to the kitchen, one of the dogs had elected himself butcher and was working over a chicken the cooks had got ready for dinner. About 2 minutes later, the cooks come in, too. When they saw the kitchen, they shouted at me for letting the dogs get it. I said it wasn't my fault. I'd just gone out to the pump for water, and if they'd been there, it wouldn't have happened. They couldn't say nothing to that, so they just grumbled amongst themselves and told me to look sharper next time. But I told Horace the truth about it. He come in from the market with a load of potatoes at supper time. We took our plates and sat outside in the backyard by the pump where nobody would bother us, and I told him. Horace was black like me and wouldn't tell on me to the cooks who was white. Horace didn't call me nosy neither. I wouldn't let him, even if he was a grown man and I was supposed to do what he told me, being a girl. I was standing close enough to touch him. I said which could have been the truth if I'd had arms 40 feet long. He twisted himself around to look at me in that way he had to see if I was making it up. Horace is mighty lanky, and he's always bending and unbending himself like a clasp knife. That's the truth? I swear it, I said, hoping I wouldn't get struck by a thunderbolt. He even looked at me. He bent and twisted for a minute, thinking about it, and then he said, "Well, Carrie, I'd have gone down myself to see him, but I didn't want to bother him." Bother him? You wouldn't have bothered him none. There was thousands of people crowding around him already. Yes, I know that, Carrie, but if he'd seen me, he'd have felt obliged to come over and shake my hand. I didn't want to put him to the trouble. I couldn't help laughing. Horace, don't give me none of your stories. What do you mean stories, he said, like I'd hurt his feelings. It ain't a story. It's the truth. All right, Horace, I said. Why would General Washington feel obliged to come over and shake your hand? Well, we will continue with Part 2, Chapter 1 in the next video.